Federal judge rules 18 to 20-year-olds have a right to carry a gun in Texas. Plus, an interview with Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms on the upward trend in support for gun control. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and check out our membership options today if you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of reporting and analysis that you can't find anywhere else. You'll also get early access to this podcast here and the opportunity to appear on the show like one of our members has again this week. Listen to the end of the show if you want to get to know one of our members. It's one of my favorite segments. But before we do that, let's bring on our guest. We got Cam Edwards from Bearing Arms, one of the other great publications if you want to keep up to date on what's happening with guns in America. So Cam, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us again.
Hey, Steve, thanks for the invite as always, man. I'm so upset with myself. I was literally wearing a Pixies t-shirt until about 5 minutes ago, and I thought I better take this off and just put on a plain t-shirt rather than,
Yeah,
you
don't want to look unprofessional.
We could have had the whole, 80s, 90s alternative music scene covered.
Yeah, this I got this from Old Navy, like a good middle-aged white guy. It's a nice Nirvana shirt. I like the design. What can you do?
Right.
I still buy band shirts at Hot Topic when they have good ones, so I'm not above buying a band shirt from Old Navy.
Me either.
Why not?
Me either.
So, also, you have some, before we get started on what we're going to talk about today, which is, some bad trends that have been identified in the latest AP poll and some of the political intrigue heading into the midterm elections. Before we get to that, there's maybe a little bit of breaking news on your beard situation. This is a closely watched news story among many people in the gun media space. You've got the great beard. It's definitely ZZ Top level right now, but you have an update for us on that.
I do. This is actually, and this is going to be a Reload exclusive here because we're breaking the news here on the podcast. But this is my last media appearance with the wizard beard. I started growing this out first time like 6 years ago when my wife was first diagnosed with cancer. Mm-hmm. And then over the years, as she's like gone into remission and she's not been getting treatment, it's gotten shorter, it's gone longer. And so it's been growing. I've trimmed it a little bit, but it's been growing for the past 2 years because the last round of immunotherapy cocktail that she was on worked. I mean, the tumors were reduced by 50%. She hasn't been on any treatment which is awesome. Over a year and a half, right? I mean, it really is incredible. We did get some news this week that's not so great. So it looks like she'll probably be resuming treatment in a few months. It's not the worst news possible, but it's probably time for another dose of the drugs, which means, of course, that my superstition that it's been the beard all along that's been keeping her healthy has now been disproven. She's been kind of bugging me. She was the one who wanted me to grow it out because she said, listen, you're already bald. If I'm losing my hair for chemotherapy, you shaving your head doesn't do anything. I want to see what you look like with a big beard. Apparently now she's seen it and she said, okay, you can cut it off now. So tomorrow yes. we are going to my beard stylist, Michael at the Confident Barbershop in Richmond, Virginia. Great guy. And we're going to get a good chunk of this chopped off. It won't go away entirely, and I may very well start to grow it out immediately. But but yeah, Monday's Cam & Company, I will look a little bit different than I've looked for the last couple of years.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. The beard is going away, at least the extended version of the beard.
The extended version, yes.
A director's cut now. It's coming down. But make sure, folks at home, you keep Mrs. E in your prayers as well, and follow along with Cam as he goes on this beard journey.
That's beard journey. I just, news. When if I start growing it out, I'm going to do a lot better about trying to get sponsorship for the beard this time around. I don't have any, beard butter sponsors or anything like that, so I got to get on that stick.
It seems like a good fit. Yeah, I mean, one of the most famous beards in all of gun media, if I would say, at this point. So, yeah.
Any ammo sponsors would like to, who might be watching, I'm open for that as well, by the way.
Well, there you go. All right. Well, so let's move into our main topic for this podcast. There's a new poll from the Associated Press that was published this week that showed a number of different things, a lot of interesting stuff in there. But one of the biggest pieces of news to come out of it, in my opinion at least, is and this actually ended up being the top line for everybody. Usually when a poll comes out, you'll see the place that's paid for it will do the main write-up, and then everybody else will just sort of copy what they said. And so the top line that the AP identified was 71% of Americans say they want either somewhat or much stricter gun laws. And there's actually quite a lot of other interesting information in there. And even that top line, I don't think is like that's bad news in and of itself if you're a gun rights advocate. But to me, the more worrying part of that is the trend that they've found since they started asking this question in this particular setup back in 2013. The number has gone up 19 points in that time. December 2013, it was 51%. Now it's 71 or 52%. Now it's 71%. So that's not a good long-term trend. And I'm interested in your take on this poll. Like, what do you think it means?
Well, so first of all, I mean, I'm always hesitant to give too much weight to any one particular poll, because we've seen just over the past couple of months, and we also saw, I can't remember what outfit it was, but I know you wrote about it, the Reload poll showing support for a ban on so-called assault weapons was at an all-time low, right? Yeah. I mean, that was just a couple of months ago. So that, it's hard to separate the noise from the actual statistics. But I think there might be a couple of things going on. First of all, since 2020, we've seen a big spike in violent crime, right? Not just, mass shootings that get a lot of attention, but violent crime has gone up by, homicides have increased by 30% in some cities. And so a lot of people may very well feel like their communities have become more dangerous places, which also accounts, I think, for the rise in gun ownership. Right. But, for every person who says, I want to be able to protect myself, there may be one other person out there, maybe two, who say, we got to ban these guns and then I'll be safe. So I think the crime trends have something to do with it. We also, again, over the past few months have had a couple of very high profile mass shootings in, Buffalo and Uvalde. And I think that has probably had an impact as well. But I wonder, too, Stephen, I mean, like, when you look at the trend legislatively over the same time period, we've seen 25 states adopt constitutional carry. We've seen, I think, in general, more states become more pro-gun than anti-gun at a time in which, according to this AP poll, support for more gun control laws has been climbing. So it may be that on some level, there are people who say, OK, we've gone far enough, or maybe even we've gone too far. And let's start to pull back. It doesn't mean that they're out there calling for confiscation, but, issues do tend to go in cycles. And it may be that, we hit peak nadir of support for gun control a couple of years ago, and now the pendulum is sort of starting to swing the other way. I think then the question becomes, what do we do about it? Right. And I think that for gun owners is the fundamental issue of how do you change these trends if, in fact, what this AP poll shows is even somewhat accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on a number of really good points there. The first one is, of course, this is just one poll. I will say that Gallup and Quinnipiac University also found, an increase in support for stricter gun control legislation. All of the post-Uvalde polls have found that, which is what you'd expect, right? Sort of point you were getting at there is you tend to have an ebb and flow when it comes to support for gun control measures, and they tend to that support tends to increase in the aftermath of mass shootings or particularly high-profile events. And Uvalde was one of the worst in American history, of course, and was sandwiched between two other ones in relatively quick succession in Buffalo and Highland Park. So, it's not surprising that number has gone up in this AP poll from the last time they did the poll, or Gallup, or or Quinnipiac. I think it's pretty safe to say that the support has gone up to some degree. What interests me more than that, and that's what a lot of these write-ups focused on, is just there's been a increase from 2 years ago when they did the last poll or whatever. But what you'll see if you look at the AP's history of that same question being asked over and over again is, yes, you'll get an increase and then a decrease when there isn't, when you're not asking the question in the immediate aftermath of a mass shooting. And then you'll get an increase again after the next one and then a decrease. The problem is that that's still trending upwards over time, over that, 9-year period. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think is the bigger concern, is where that's headed and what that means. If it's true. Now, Gallup has a longer history on their poll, and there were times in the 1990s, and this tracks with your theory about, rising murder rates having an impact. In the 90s were a much more violent time than right now, even still with these increases we've seen. And support in the Gallup poll was much higher back in the 90s, but also the 90s is where we got new federal gun laws. And so that's what I think is the core concern here, is like, as this support for stricter gun laws, even if it's just a generalized, I think we need stricter gun laws concept, as that rises, the probability you're getting more gun control goes up as well, especially at the federal level, I think. And we just did get a gun bill, right? So I don't know, do you think that we're past, it sounds like maybe you think this is crested already and we're just seeing the sort of after effects before these numbers come back down maybe, or are you concerned about them continuing on that trajectory?
Yeah, no, I am concerned about it continuing on that trajectory because, as you say, with the AP poll, when you look over the last decade or so, even the trend lines keep going up, right? Mm-hmm. And I think as gun owners, again, we always need to be looking at the arguments that gun control advocates are making and the arguments that are resonating with the American people. Because, listen, if you're a Second Amendment advocate and you're not willing to acknowledge that non-gun owners are the majority in this country, you're not going to be an effective advocate, right? So we're already starting out from a position of we have to be politically effective, be able to talk to and persuade non-gun owners that, gun control is not the way to a safer society, because many of those non-gun owners don't really care about the constitutionality of a particular law. Let's be honest, right? And so I think the argument has to be made on sort of different grounds. And I don't know, honestly, how good a job we are doing at that, particularly, again, when the anti-gun message, I think, is false, but it's powerful. It's, if you want to protect your kids, you'll pass this common sense regulation, right? If you don't want to see, second graders murdered in a classroom, well, then by God, you'll call for banning these guns. Think back to Carolyn Maloney's comments during the House Oversight hearing with the Daniel Defense and Ruger CEO, right? Where, she literally asked at one point, how many children have to die before you'll stop making these products, right? So that's the argument that's coming out from the other side. And I don't know. Hey, I don't know. The media doesn't really want to hear from our side all that often. But I also think that, over the past couple of years, the NRA used to be a very effective advocacy organization, but you don't see NRA people on TV anymore. I can't remember the last time, Wayne LaPierre did Meet the Press or CBS Sunday Morning.
Yeah, it's probably been a decade, right, at this point.
At least, 3 years or so.
I think it's been longer than that. Yeah.
It may very well have been, but I think that we've got to be creative in how we are talking to people. And it starts, I guess, with talking to our friends and family and, looking for that audience of one as opposed to the audience of millions. But I think also, too, like we do need to be able to address and engage the arguments from gun control advocates and point out why they're wrong.
Yeah, I just think that there's this sort of tendency, especially now after Bruin, that the courts are going to fix all these problems for us. Even if they did pass an weapons ban, it probably wouldn't stand up in court in the long run. And so maybe it's not as much of a concern to be persuasive or to win that sort of public relations battle. But it sounds like you don't agree with that necessarily.
No, I don't. I mean, look, we just saw Roe versus Wade overturned. So, I think it's fair to say that the at first opportunity, when Democrats have a majority of their appointed justices on the Supreme Court, Heller and McDonald and Bruen are all in the crosshairs, right? Mm-hmm. And so we honestly need to be laying the groundwork in the court of public opinion now, so that when Democrats are in a position to do something in the court of law to weaken or obliterate our Second Amendment rights, we've already started to persuade Americans that that's the wrong thing to do. That Prohibition 2.0 is not going to do any better than the first go round when it was alcohol. So no, I don't think we can afford to just point to Bruen and say, well, I mean, look, if there wasn't, a comparable gun control law in American history, well, then it's not constitutional. Because again, the argument from the left is if you want to stop kids from being murdered in their classroom, you'll support this. That's a very emotional argument.
Yeah.
Talking about the constitutionality of a particular gun control law is not emotional for most people, right? It just doesn't resonate the same way. So I think that's why we need to be talking about, firearms in terms of protecting human life. We need to be talking about armed citizen stories. We need to do a much better job of promoting defensive gun uses within. I think we do a pretty good job. You do, and we do at Bearing Arms. I have an armed citizen story every day on Cam and Company. But let's even say within the broader conservative media, I'd like to see more emphasis placed on those types of stories. And then, listen, there's some great advocacy that's happening at the grassroots level. I wrote about this at Bearing Arms earlier this week. I don't know if you saw this. There's a group out of Louisville called Armed and Educated. And they put on an event that was like, it was the perfect counter to a gun buyback, because when folks went, they got like a 15-minute lesson on gun safety, like how to store a firearm. Here's how you handle the firearm, just real basic stuff. And then they got like a basket full of groceries. And they've done this with gas card giveaways. Like, they've held the 15-minute sessions right there at the pump, but you get a $25 gas card and you get a little bit of knowledge about firearms. That to me is such a creative and inventive way of outreach to the community. And it's so easy. This is something that we could be replicating in every city across the country. Every state level or local 2A group could be doing this on a weekly or monthly basis. And that, I think, we need to be doing more of those types of things to sort of get beyond our talking points and to actually, connect with some of the Americans that I think are reachable on this issue.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me a lot too of like Rick Ector's program up in Detroit.
Yeah. Tony Simon's diversity shoot in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I mean, like, there are a lot of these efforts that are underway. I don't know how much of that is getting, support from the big organizations, but again, like, I just think there's so much fertile ground to be sown here. And it is already being done in some cases at the local level. We just need to see a lot more of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really good point about not just that persuasion is necessary, but also here are some examples of how to do it in a good way. But now to bring the party back down, though, another interesting point to me in this AP poll, and perhaps just in the fact that we still see that increase in support for gun control. In 2022, after a mass shooting, even though that AP poll itself identified a 7-point jump in people who say they have a gun in the home, obviously you and I both, and I've espoused this idea a number of times, but I believe that the rise in new gun ownership, especially among demographics that have not traditionally been associated with gun ownership in America, minorities, women, people who live in more urban or suburban areas, and people who use guns for self-defense or competitive shooting instead of hunting. This sort of gun culture 2.0 that we've talked a lot about, that the rise in those sorts of gun owners and just the general increase in new gun owners over the last several years is likely to lead to fewer people wanting more gun restrictions. Because when people become gun owners, polling has found that they generally are less supportive of gun restrictions probably for fairly straightforward reasons. If you buy a gun, you probably don't want to have that gun taken away from you or your ability to do what you want with the gun restricted, right? But we're not seeing that effect necessarily in these new polls. Does that concern you at all, or how do you read that?
It concerns me. But at the same time, again, like, this is why I try not to put too much stock in any given poll, because this was, I don't know how many people were surveyed for this, but let's say it was 1,000 people.
It was 1,300.
Okay, so 1,500. So the experience of a new gun owner in a state like California may be very different than the experience of a new gun owner in a state like Texas or Florida, simply because of the state level laws that are already in place, right? So it may be that a new gun owner in Texas says, wow, I can't believe that I can carry without a license to carry. This is crazy. I think we need some more gun control laws. But the new gun owner in California may say, it's freaking ridiculous. I had to wait 10 days before I could go and pick up my firearm when I had this abusive ex who's, stalking me the entire time. No, I don't want to see more gun control laws. So, just like everybody's reason for being a gun owner is personal. I think the reasons why people might want more or less gun control also is probably, in many cases, personal in nature. They're not just looking at aggregate statistics. They're thinking about their own lives. And again, I think ultimately for most people who even say that they are in favor of more gun control laws, this is my personal opinion, I think most of that comes from less of a hatred or fear of firearms and more of a desire for increased public or personal safety, And so I think, again, when we can start to talk about, like, this is something that I try to write about at Bearing Arms, even though it's not directly Second Amendment related. I like to talk about some of the things that, we're seeing in the criminal justice system that, even if you think gun control is a great idea, unless we fix these flaws in the justice system, nothing's going to improve. We have a public defender shortage in a lot of states right now. People are being freed because their cases aren't going to trial in a speedy fashion. So you've got, criminal defendants who are back out on the street. Conversely, you may have people who are stuck behind bars for a year or more because they can't get a public defender appointed to them, which is also the wrong thing to do. The bail policies that we see in states like California, in New York, California Attorney General Rob Bonta released a report on Thursday showing that violent crime and property crime, both up in California, arrest rates are down at the same time, right? So it's not like fewer people are being arrested because California's just becoming a safer place. More people are getting away with murder and carjackings and robberies, and things of that nature. So until we actually start to address, the left talks about the inequities in the justice system. I'm just talking about the nuts and bolts of how, our criminal justice system is supposed to work. And, I think, I don't know how much this argument resonates, but to me, it just seems silly, not to mention unconstitutional in many cases, but it seems silly to say, well, let's throw another gun law on the books when we're failing to address serious offenders, right? But meanwhile, we can point to places like Dallas, Texas. They saw, I believe it was a 30% reduction in homicides last year, the first year the constitutional carry was in effect. They used a strategy where they were looking at like micro hotspots. Where are the homicides? Where are the shootings actually taking place? And flooding, that half block or flooding that one corner with resources. Buffalo, New York saw what they did in Dallas. They implemented that this year. They've seen, I believe, a 36% reduction in homicides in Buffalo. So, I think if we can point out as gun owners that, I think it was the police chief in Buffalo said, it's about 75 people in that city who are driving violent crime.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, that should be an argument that works with non-gun owners. Do you really want to try to pass a new law that could criminalize tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of people, with the harm falling disproportionately on, the working class, on minorities, the people who the left complains are over-policed? Or maybe, we can do a targeted deterrence. We can actually identify those individuals who are responsible for driving violent crime. We can try to get them help if they're fixable, but we can also, prosecute the hell out of them if they're not going to change their ways. That's a program that has proven results. It's got a track record of success. Why don't we try to do that and make those investments rather than trying to turn a constitutionally protected right into a criminal offense? Yeah,
and that is similar logic behind the violence interruption programs that you've seen, which have been supported in fairly rare fashion across the political spectrum, and largely because it doesn't involve new gun bans or broad targeting of categories of people, but is meant to be more focused, like you're describing there, and also to sort of probably goes hand in hand with what you're talking about, because community violence interruption programs are meant to be non-police operations, because obviously many communities don't have a good relationship with the police departments and so forth. And there's obviously a ton more about criminal justice reform that we could get into. But another thing I wanted to, and maybe we shouldn't in a future podcast actually, but another point I wanted to make is while there isn't necessarily an obvious effect on the generalized support for some more restrictions on gun laws, which is, more of a barometer of how people are feeling and less about what policies they would support. We have seen an effect, I think, perhaps from those new gun owners on some of the support for some of those specific policies, right? In the fact that almost every post-Uvalde poll has shown a decrease in support for assault bans. This AP poll is the one outlier, actually, and maybe could give you some indication that its sample is a little more skewed towards the pro-gun control side of things, perhaps. But its trends are in line with what other polls are showing. But maybe the individual numbers might be a little bit a little hotter on the pro-gun control side. But I do think that effect is probably in part because of new gun owners. And you also have seen a different poll from the AP, which asked new gun owners what they think about gun control policies or various gun policies. And the ones who were created during the last 2 years were actually less favorable of gun restrictions than previous gun owners. So I don't think it makes sense to completely disregard the effect new gun owners have had on support for gun control. It's just hasn't been a sea change to this point that maybe some people had expected to see. And so, I think it's important to, like you said, not rely on one poll. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, the trends that are identified in that AP poll, but it is only one poll, and there is other information out there that might push back against some of the conclusions you'd draw if you just looked at that one poll. And similarly, though, I want to look at one race that everybody has been talking about in terms of the upcoming midterms. We've had this cycle of hype going into the last couple of months about a red wave coming. The polling looks really good for Republicans in this upcoming midterm. Going back a couple months, the president's poll numbers are terrible. But now things, the conventional wisdom right now, what everyone's talking about is the idea that that's all falling away and Republicans are now in trouble and Democrats are have a much better chance of holding the House or picking up seats in the Senate, even because there was the voter ballot initiative in Kansas, which was an abortion, which would have allowed more abortion restrictions in the state, that lost unexpectedly. And then you saw the Democrat win the special election in New York 19, which is something of a swing district. Then most people expected the Republican to win that race. So now the conversation is all back the other way. Democrats are having a comeback. The president's approval ratings are up a little bit. He's back into like the 40s when he had been in the 30s. So I'm interested in your take where things are headed. What's the nightmare scenario to start off with? What do you think the worst case could be?
Well, I mean, the worst case is we don't take back the Senate, and we don't take back the House. That would be the nightmare scenario, right? Democrats even add seats because on paper anyway, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are the two senators that are preventing the filibuster from being nuked, right? So let's say you replace Pat Toomey with John Fetterman, who's already come out and said he's in favor of nuking the filibuster. Let's say Ron Johnson loses in Wisconsin, and all of a sudden Democrats, pick up a net of 2 seats. Theoretically, if they hold the House as well, then they could change the rules, get rid of the filibuster. They could pass legislation in the Senate with 51 votes, and then they would implement their gun control ban, or their ban on so-called assault weapons, and large capacity magazines. They would repeal the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act. They would try to destroy the firearms industry. That would be the nightmare scenario, right? If there's no check whatsoever on anti-gun Democrats in either chamber of commerce or Congress, rather, then gun owners are going to be one of the primary targets of the next session.
Right. And I'll say, like, right now, it's not out of this world to think could happen.
It is
not. I mean, the president himself,
unthinkable.
Yeah, the president himself just made the exact comments that you're talking about. He said, if we hold the House and pick up 2 seats in the Senate, he specifically said 2 seats, that will pass an assault weapons ban and all these other things that they obviously also want to pass. And with the trend, the way things have trended the last couple of weeks, it's not impossible to think that could happen if things continue to trend in that same direction. Now, how likely is it that that's going to be the case?
Well, so, and again, it's interesting because it's not really gun stuff that's driving this. Right now, we're getting into the effects of, the Dobbs decision, what's going to happen to the economy, right? Gas prices have been going down. There's been, a little bit of good news on the economic front. At the same time, there have been a lot of, big warning signs that things are going to get rough and rocky this fall. Yeah. So I listen, if inflation starts to go up again in September and October, when people start, I'm already clinching, getting ready to pay for my propane to heat my house this winter, because I know that my bill is going to be hundreds of dollars higher than it was last time around. Yeah. So, I think that I don't think the economy is going to save Joe Biden. Let's put it that way. And I think that there may be another swing back towards Republicans as we get closer to November, like, let's say when the October numbers start to come out. What kind of impact that's going to have, I don't know, because, early voting starts so early in some states now. So that by the time, some of that bad inflationary news hits in mid-October, a lot of ballots may have already been cast. I think really, I think it's undeniable that the Dobbs decision and what I see as the attempt by a lot of red state lawmakers to really overreach on abortion in the immediate aftermath, I think that really has engaged particularly women voters. That has been to the almost exclusive help of Democrats. And, the messaging in Kansas, I thought, was really interesting. I talked with Rebecca Schmoy about this with the DC Project a few weeks ago. She's running for state representative in Kansas, and she won her primary the night that ballot referendum failed. And one of the commercials that I saw for this ballot referendum was entirely freedom based, Stephen. Mm-hmm. It was, if you didn't like the government telling you what to do with mask mandates, if you don't like the government telling you what to do with teaching your kids, if you don't like the government telling you what to do, yada, 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 then you don't want the government telling you what to do when it comes to women's health care. And I think that's how they framed it, all right, or reproductive rights. It was not, it was a message that was tailor-made for Kansas, but it was a pro-freedom message, right? And so I think this is the danger I think Republicans are finding themselves in, is that, they are being portrayed as being anti-freedom or very pick and choose when it comes to particular freedoms, right?
Well, I think, to me, it's less about the, I think you probably have a good point there about whether or not Republicans are viewed as being overreaching on abortion or, and I don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty of each political component of how this stuff's going to turn out. I think what's more, because I think it's really hard to read how, I agree with all your points there. I think it's hard generally, and you probably agree with this, to feel out how exactly one issue is going to drive an election one way or the other. Certainly the Kansas referendum and the fact that the Democrat in that swing district ran heavily on abortion implies that it's going to be a significant issue in the midterms, but it's hard to predict okay, so where's that going to play out as over the entire House of Representatives? Maybe it'll limit how many gains the Republicans can realistically make. But I think there's even beyond the sort of individual issues at play. Obviously, voting for the Sullivan ban is probably going to hurt a number of Democrats in more vulnerable districts, more purple districts, swing districts. And so that
especially since the Democrats aren't going to do the police funding bill, or at least they haven't.
Right. Yeah.
So far, right. So now you got folks like Abigail Spanberger on record as voting for a gun ban, but not being able to say I voted to fund police. Mm-hmm. And you're right. I think that is going to have an impact on.
I think those individual issues will have an impact, a disparate impact depending on what district you're looking at. But the bigger thing to me that would, and I'm interested in your take on this, that would imply that Republicans will probably still win the House at least. The Senate's a little more of a toss-up. It's hard. That could go either way. But the House, it's a midterm election. The Republicans only need to pick up 5 seats. There are extremely rare circumstances where the party in power doesn't lose seats in a midterm election. And generally the way these go, in my experience, and you've been watching this even longer than I have, but usually in a midterm, there's a ton of hype around the out of party, the out of power party has all this momentum, and the polls look great, 6 months out, and this is going to be a wave election, and they're going to pick up 40 seats or 60 seats. It's going to be like 2010 or 2018 or whatever year you point to as like a big wave election year. Then things get a little bit closer and things start to tighten up a little bit. There's plenty of news events that can come and go where the president's approval fluctuates a little bit, and you start to get talk of, well, maybe it's not going to be a wave, and maybe the in power party is going to pull it off, and they're going to actually hold on to everything. And then when you get closer to election day, it swings a little bit back in the other direction. That's my perception of how these things usually go. And it seems to me we're in that sort of middle period where, they lost this special election. There was a ballot initiative. There's 1 or 2 things you can point to. The in power party got these bills through that they can run on now. It's going to excite their base and blah, blah, blah. But there's sort of a fundamental nature at play here with midterm elections, which is that the president's not on the ballot. So whatever party he was part of, they're less likely to have as many people turn out in this election. It's just as a matter of natural course. And I think it would take something really epic to prevent Republicans from at least taking the House back. because they just don't need to pick up many seats.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And with redistricting, I think it, again, it would be, it would be the nightmare scenario for Republicans because it is so achievable, right? It is expected that Republicans would take back the House, given historical trends and given the small majority that Democrats currently have. I mean, look, Democrats lost seats in 2020 in a presidential election year. Republicans were able to gain seats in the House, right? So this should be an environment that is very favorable to the out party, which right now is the GOP.
Right.
I think that it is fair to say that Democrats have had a decent political news cycle, particularly over the last month, as gas prices have been falling. Certainly, their friends in the media have been happy to tout that. Trying to puff up the economic news that they're seeing, but I think you're right that this polling is probably an artifact of what's in the news right now.
Yeah. And
I would also say that, listen, there are a lot of Americans who aren't following news very closely. They'll start to pay attention to the elections maybe after Labor Day. But they're tuned out. A lot of folks are on vacation, or maybe they're working 2 jobs to pay for gas and clothes and back to school stuff. But I think when Americans do start to engage as we get closer to the elections, you will start to see a change. But again, you make a really good point when you talk about how hard it is to make these national predictions about what are pretty individualized races. In Texas, for instance, the gubernatorial polls that I've seen have shown no real movement. Like Beto O'Rourke has gained compared to 6 months ago.
Yeah.
But he hasn't gained much ground over the last 2 months, right? He's still stuck at 6 or 7, anywhere from 5 to 7 points behind Greg Abbott in polling.
Well, 10 was the last one I saw, but yeah.
Okay, so there you go. Again, I would caution people not to read too much into these national polls, because I think ultimately this isn't a national election.
Yeah.
Right. You make that case with the president not being on the ballot. These are, they may be federal offices, but these are local races for the most part.
Sure. And I think ultimately what I would come down to on both of these points that we've talked about, both of these issues we've gone through here today, is like, there is reason to be concerned. These are not, crazy thoughts out there about the long-term upward swing of people wanting stricter gun laws generally, and the concern that Republicans could blow this midterm election and then Democrats could basically just, eliminate the filibuster and pass whatever they want. These are not things that are crazy to think, and really something people should probably be concerned about and put thought into and put effort into counteracting. But at the same time, they're not necessarily the most likely outcome, and they're not. Maybe there are good reasons to think that there's counter narratives that make sense as well, right? Would that sum this whole episode up fairly well?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right about that, and again, I think that gun owners really should be looking more long term. I mean, obviously, pay very close attention to what's going on here. I would encourage folks to get active and engaged for this election cycle. But yeah, don't lose sight of the long term. The gun control lobby is really good at playing the long game, and sometimes we're more reactive than proactive. And I don't think that's to our advantage. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point going forward, so that we can, again, ensure that the trend line is towards the recognition and embrace of all of our constitutionally protected rights, but that includes the right to keep and bear arms.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us again this week, Cam. Where can people find more of your writing and your own show?
Yes. So just go to bearingarms.com. We've got the link to the Bearing Arms Cam and Company podcast right there on the homepage, but you can also find us on YouTube and Rumble and all of the major podcast platforms. And then the writing, again, at bearingarms.com.
Awesome.
And thank you for the invite. As always, Steve, we got to get you back on Cam and Company here before long.
Yes. We'll have to do another swap episode soon.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we're going to head over to the news update now. Thank you so much, Ken.
Thanks, Stephen.
All right. It's time for the news update. We're here with contributing writer Jake Fogelman. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm doing all right, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I got a new Nirvana shirt. That's pretty cool.
Very nice.
I like it. But you have a new story that's even better. This one comes out of the federal courts out of Texas and deals with 18 to 20-year-olds, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, as you said, a judge in the Northern District of Texas, a federal court judge, just struck down the portion of Texas's gun carry law that limits adults who can carry being 21 and older. Basically said there's no historical tradition in this country of limiting the rights of young adults to bear arms, and put an injunction on the state of Texas from enforcing that provision of the law. So that's a pretty big deal, especially because Texas is a permitless carry state. So extending the rights of permitless carry to 18 to 20-year-olds is definitely a big ruling.
Yeah, and this was this is from the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas. Judge Mark Pittman. He wrote, based on the Second Amendment's text as informed by founding era history and tradition, the court concludes that the Second Amendment protects against this prohibition. Texas's statutory scheme must therefore be enjoined to the extent that law-abiding 18 to 20-year-olds are prohibited from applying for a license to carry a handgun. So this requires that Texas accept applications to carry for anyone who's an adult, basically.
Right.
And so that's a pretty big ruling. It's one of the first post-Bruin rulings, of course. We've had a couple now, and you're starting to see the impact. Although I will say, just as an aside, we also got a ruling about the President Biden's ghost gun kit ban rule that went into effect this week. And a federal judge in that case upheld the ability of the ATF to redefine what a firearm is, and didn't necessarily do a full analysis of the history, but effectively said that there is a longstanding tradition of regulating commercial sale of firearms in the United States. And so we had sort of dueling rulings.
That's right.
This week. But this one, I think, is a bit more significant because it's in line with what we're seeing on the front of young adults or adults under 21. And there have been a couple of cases that dealt with the gun rights of that group. You wrote about a couple of these in your piece. What were some of the other ones?
Yeah. So last year, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal appeals court, struck down basically a prohibition on people 18 to 20-year-old from being able to purchase handguns, which is a federal law. And it struck that down, so that's unconstitutional. And this predates Bruin, as you pointed out. And earlier this year, another ruling that predates Bruin out of the Ninth Circuit, a 3-judge panel for the Ninth Circuit said that California's ban on under 21-year-olds purchasing semi-automatic centerfire rifles is how they defined it. Essentially, AR-15s
Right, what California calls assault weapons.
Right.
In California, they had a ban on anyone 18 to 20 being able to purchase those guns.
Right. And the judge struck that down. He said that was unconstitutional. So, yeah, as you pointed out, it's kind of a trend that we're starting to see in the federal court system where judges are starting to find that there's really no rationale, or at least in their opinion, there's no rationale for restricting Second Amendment rights to this group. There's no history for it. And I think that's only going to be more clear in light of Bruin. And this judge here in the Texas case drew pretty extensively on the history of the American founding. He pointed out to the fact that 18 to 20-year-olds were regularly part of the militia, so therefore carried arms. And there's some interesting citations in there as well. He pointed to military heroes throughout the country's history. If you guys look at the ruling, pointed to people like Audie Murphy, famous World War II hero. But basically to just essentially make the point that, look, young adults have been able to bear arms forever in this country, so there's no reason to necessarily restrict them from doing so now.
Yeah, or at the very least, you can't put a special prohibition on them that isn't applied to everyone. The ruling doesn't come down on the idea that, permitless carry has to be the only way of regulating gun carry. But if you're going to do permitless carry, you can't deny that to 18 to 20-year-olds.
Right.
Because historically they weren't singled out from gun rights protections. And in fact, were, as you just mentioned there, a significant part of the group that won independence in the United States. And
right.
Of course, they remain a significant part of our military today and law
right.
enforcement.
That's right.
So.
One thing that kind of tempers the ruling a little bit, though, he did, before enjoining the law, he put a 30-day delay on that order, essentially to give the state of Texas time to consider an appeal. I reached out to the Department of Public Safety. Didn't hear back about whether or not they intend to do so. But I think that creates an interesting dynamic where now the government of Texas, which is a very red state, a very pro-gun state, is now put in an awkward position where do they challenge this and try to uphold this restriction, or do they allow the ruling to stand and let 18 to 20-year-olds carry guns going forward?
Yeah. And, that's an especially fraught question in Texas right now, because one of the other interesting things is as the courts have gone towards protecting the Second Amendment rights of 18 to 20-year-olds, public opinion has gone the other way.
Right.
Especially this year when after the events in Buffalo and Uvalde, especially where you had 18-year-olds carrying out these horrific attacks, public opinion has shifted significantly towards either severely restricting the gun rights of that age group, or at least putting further restrictions on them. For instance, the bipartisan gun bill that was passed earlier this year, the federal level adds a new layer of scrutiny for 18 to 20-year-olds when they're going to buy guns. They're effectively put into a sort of de facto waiting period as the law requires a more thorough, or more, I don't know what the right word for this is, but more extensive check that involves actual, instead of databases being queried, you have to call up actual people, which is inevitably going to add time to that check, which is why in practice it feels more like a waiting period. But you've seen support for restricting the sale of AR-15s and other firearms to 18 to 20-year-olds. Florida passed a ban like that after Parkland, where you had another shooter who was in that age group. And so public opinion has shifted towards wanting to restrict the rights of 18 to 20-year-olds, whereas at the same time, the courts have begun to add more protections for their gun rights.
No, I think that's a good point. We'll see how that plays out in the political sphere, because you might see a lot of backlash to these rulings if that's the case. If public opinion keeps moving that way, but judicial decisions keep going the other way, it could create a pretty tense environment, I think, in terms of gun politics. Of
course, that's sort of the point of the courts, right? Is that they're meant to protect people's rights even when it's unpopular. So it is an interesting phenomenon to see as the general public is less willing to protect the rights of this age group, while the courts have become more willing to do it. But you're right. That could obviously lead to some tension down the line. But, you see this my guess is that public opinion is not too favorable towards people who take the Fifth Amendment, for instance, or to Fourth Amendment protections for people that most suspect are doing something illegal. So that's sort of the nature of having these protections in the first place.
Even that free speech these days is pretty unpopular with certain crowds, but courts routinely uphold free speech rights. So that's a good point.
That's what it's not necessarily an unusual thing for the courts to buck public opinion on when it comes to these sorts of protections. But at the same time, there's a relatively new trend in for the federal courts to move in this direction of, saying that that you can't specifically restrict gun rights for these age groups. So if you're going to pass a permitless carry law, you can't say that 18 to 20-year-olds who are otherwise law-abiding can't partake in the same legal protections as anyone over 21.
No, that's right.
So we'll continue to follow that, of course. I doubt that this will be the last time an 18 to 20-year-old restriction is before the court, and it'll be interesting. You're right; it'll be very interesting to see what Texas does, given their reputation as a pro-gun state. Are they going to continue to fight this? I think that stay that the judge put on is a fairly common thing. You'll see.
Yeah.
It doesn't always happen, but it's pretty common for a judge to stay their ruling to give time for the government to decide on whether it wants to appeal or not when one of its laws is struck down. So
sure.
We'll continue to follow, though. I'm sure you will update us when there is a development in this case.
Absolutely.
But for now, we've got another member segment this week. So let's head over to that. All right. Welcome back to another one of my favorite segments, the member segment, where we get to talk to a Reload member. We have Cody Claxton here with us today. Welcome to the show, Cody.
Thank you. I'm really excited about this. I've been reading the Reload now for, I think ever since you launched it. And I'm always looking forward to the newsletters that come out, and your reporting is really insightful and timely. And so I have, by the way, so I promote this. I have about a newsletter of about 300 members for IDPA, and I always put your link in there, and I make sure everybody knows about your periodical.
That's really kind of you. It's very nice of you to say. Really appreciate your support, especially somebody from the very beginning. That's really awesome. Obviously, this is the Reload is a tiny publication in terms of we don't have any big corporate backing or anything like that. So it's really the members' support that is the only thing that allows us to continue to operate. But I want to talk a little bit more about you. So how did you get interested in firearms? Where did you grow up shooting, or was it something you came to later in life?
It was something I came to later in life. I grew up in Florida, and when I was a teenager, we would go out shooting with my dad and my uncles, but we were shooting armadillos with a .22 long rifle, But once I went into the military, I got trained on an AR-15 M16 at the time, and it was just a part of basic training. And after that, I didn't see any action in the military. So after that, I went to college, got married, raised kids. I really didn't see, nobody had ever threatened my life. So I didn't really see any reason for me to own a firearm. So I was kind of an anti-gun guy. I kind of, had why do people need guns? And the future of humanity should be peaceful, right? And it wasn't until I was divorced and had my kids were away at college. I was home by myself, and I thought, there was some crime in the neighborhood, so I thought I'll go get a pistol for home defense. Mm-hmm. I like to tell the story. I took the pistol to the range, to the NRA range actually, and shot it. And I thought there's clearly something wrong with this gun because it doesn't shoot straight. So yes. I thought maybe a different gun would work. Well, that one didn't shoot straight either. And then I realized it was me. And
yes, I identified the problem was not the gun.
Exactly. And so I saw somebody at the range who was really good, and I thought, I'd like to be that good, right? So I asked her how she got to be that way. And she said she shoots IDPA, which stands for International Defensive Pistol Association.
Yes, that's one of the most popular competitive shooting leagues out there, right?
It is. It is. We have
disciplines, I guess.
Exactly. The USPSA and IDPA are the biggest. I was interested in IDPA because it was more defensive in nature, as opposed to pure competition, which is mostly what USPSA is about, right? And the other thing is, it was fun. I mean, there were things, I would go to matches and they would have you sitting in the front of a Jeep, and you had to defend yourself, from targets around you, or you would have to be carrying a briefcase and you'd have to shoot while moving. So there were a lot of skills that I was totally unfamiliar with. So it was really fun to do. About a year after doing that, I got a death threat. Somebody threatened to kill me. Yeah. It's kind of a strange thing. It was a voicemail, and somebody had forwarded a voicemail from another location, so the police couldn't track it. But it was basically, the guy knew my name, he knew my address, and he said, you're a dead man, kind of thing. And so that's when I thought to myself, my gosh, I might actually have to use a weapon to really defend myself. And then I began to realize it isn't really just about having a firearm, that somebody could just try to beat me up, And that's when I said, well, you know what? I'm going to learn some combatives. So I went to Krav Maga for 3 years, and I learned combatives, a lot of good combatives, gun disarms, things like that, right? And at the same time, I was going out and shooting IDPA and kind of learning how to shoot better.
Yeah. So you're really, really taking on a holistic approach to self-defense, which is something that a lot of high-end, gun trainers will recommend, like John Correa over at Active Self-Protection, which, by the way, I do their podcast every week. So I've probably plugged that more often on this show, but they have a great podcast that talks about self-defense encounters. But that's one of the things they're big on is, don't just train at the range with your gun. You got to think about all sorts of different potential self-defense encounters. What happens if somebody attacks you and it's not lethal force? You can't use your gun. You're not justified. Right. Well, what are you going to do then? Like, you're just going to, I guess, get beat up, or you got to have some plan. I carry pepper spray, but obviously being competent in grappling and physical fighting, I mean, that can also come into play in a deadly encounter. Absolutely. Well, too. I mean, so you might have to fight with somebody over a gun in a life or death situation. But so that's interesting. So you really run the whole gambit. You had experience in the military. You stayed away from guns for a while after that, but then got interested in competitive shooting, and then you had a real world, death threat that took your training to another level. Yeah. That's pretty fascinating story. Through the whole phase. Usually it's like people get into one or the other, or and that's I joined the military, so that's how I got interested in guns, or I had a threat against my life, so that's how I got interested, or I liked the competition aspect of it. But you really ran the whole gambit. Yeah, and then once I started doing a lot more IDPA, there was a club up in Thurmont, Maryland, that had lost its match director. And one of my mentors at the time, he said, hey, why don't you consider becoming a match director? So then I started actually designing stages, for IDPA matches. And so I really have had a lot of fun with that. People tell me I design really challenging stages, not so much from a marksmanship perspective, although there is that, right? Mm-hmm. But it's more like one of the stages I just had, you were stuck behind a tank trap on your knees, and you had to bend down and around and work your way around a tank trap in order to shoot some targets, around some barrels in front of you. We had another stage where you were sitting in the back seat of a car, and the car was actually up on the berm, so it was tilted, and you were in the back seat. It was a bench seat. So you had to hold yourself up to one side of the car, and then when you let go, you would kind of slide down to the other side of the car, and like you'd been in a car accident. Oh, wow. And so I designed stages that I think are going to put you in a realistic situation. Where do you get your inspiration for that? Do you watch things like Active Self-Protection for sort of real world encounters, or how do you come up with the stage ideas? I do.
A lot of ideas, I have to say, you know, because I used to do a lot of matches and sanction matches as well, where people did a lot of challenging things. And I kind of learned from the masters of that art, right? And so then I just improvise. You know, I'll just say, okay, I want to put the car up on the berm. I want to make it a little more interesting. You know, the idea just kind of occurs to me, and then I build the stage around that. And so we just had our big sanctioned match up at called the Potomac Grail up in Thurmont, Maryland. We had 120 shooters. Here's an interesting thing about what's happening in the firearms community and the firearms marketplace. 53 of those 120 shooters are shooting carry optics. It has been a huge growth in people who are carrying and shooting concealed carry optics guns. And
the market for that's really exploded.
Recently. It's taken off. Unbelievable.
So many more options now.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it's to the point now where, I mean, it used to be many years ago, 1911 was the gun, right? Everybody shot 1911 in competition and they carried 1911s. Then there was kind of the Glock trend, right? Glock became very popular. And then I would say around 2010 or so, we really started seeing some foreign guns come in. So CZs became very popular, the Kinnick, and a number of other, so to say, foreign guns. Springfield XD guns, which are made overseas in that area, were also very popular. So it's really been interesting to kind of see the growth in and the migration, so to say, in guns, and the quality of the guns, and also the interesting ways in which guns have changed, like, you know, the Sig Sauer design, where the serial number is not on the frame, on the outside frame. It's like a shell. The serial number's on the mechanism inside, so you can change the shell out. Which was really kind of threw the ATF for a little bit of a loop, because they're like, oh, wait a minute, are we okay with this?
right. Yes. No, I mean, the move to modularity, to incorporating a lot more, I would say, competition features into your standard carry guns, like an RMR cut for a red dot. You know, that's really accelerated over the last couple of years. You can see it if you go into any gun store or go to any IDPA match. But we really appreciate you taking the time to come on and just share a little bit of your story.
Sure.
Can you tell people, you know, how you found about the Reload, and maybe why they might want to consider too? Put a little ad in here at the end.
Sure. I mean, you know, I can't remember. I think I can't exactly remember how I learned about the Reload, but it might have been through a VCDL newsletter or something. But in any case, it was, I think, your first newsletter, and I was like, this is great. And I also like the, you know, the professionalism of your journalism. You wanted to get it right. It wasn't just kind of a propaganda push, so to say. It was, let's try to get the reporting right, but let's also make sure that we're not, that we're, you know, so to say, embracing the gun community in a way that is holistic and beneficial, right? And so one of the things that I really liked about the Reload is also the newsletter is really great, because it kind of lets me know what's coming up. And that's also something that I can link to in my newsletter, so that other people can try to read your and what do you call you call it a journal? What do you really call it?
Publication.
Publication. Okay.
That's I think that's probably the best term for it. You know, it's newsletter driven, but we have a website obviously as well, where people can go and read the stories, or even the newsletters themselves are also published on the website. So, you know, we try to give people as many options as possible with the resources we have to read the reporting we're doing, and then give that extra value to the members. You know, a lot of analysis pieces are members only, and they get the podcast a day early and they get to be on the podcast, just like you right now.
Okay.
So we try to find ways to bring extra value so that people can support the reporting, but also get, their money's worth when they're buying a subscription.
By the way, your last podcast, I can't remember the name of the guy, the Washington State.
Yes, Alan Gottlieb from the Second Amendment Foundation.
Oh my God, that was such a fantastic podcast. I think I listened to that 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, he's been around forever and is really one of those guys that's driving the legal part of the gun rights movement, but doesn't get as much of the attention as like the NRA or somebody like that.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know how much more time we have.
I think this is about it.
Okay.
But actually, so you mentioned you have a newsletter. Can you tell people where they might want to? Is it something that's public? Can people sign up for it?
Sure, you can sign up for it. It's actually part of Google Groups. So you go to Google Groups and you search on Thermont IDPA. That's my newsletter, the Thermont IDPA newsletter. And also, I should mention, I'm now the area coordinator for IDPA from South Carolina all the way to Delaware. So if anybody's interested in getting into defensive-based competitive shooting, you can reach me there, or also my email address is va.md.idpa@gmail.com. And I'll find a club where you can attend and get you started on your first match.
Awesome. Well, I might be emailing you soon. I've done a little bit of IDPA and competitive shooting, but only a tiny amount. So maybe I should start doing some more. So
that sounds good.
Look for my email as well.
I will.
But thank you so much for coming on. And that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again next week.